We really put specialization on Hamilton at the last one, and we'd like to maybe do some things on the second chat with maybe Decker's Corners and Horns Corners and the Cedar Creek area. So watch again for that. There's coffee and cookies, which some of you have found, and later on, I will be passing the hat to help defray the expenses that the Culture Center has for the chats. And also, my good friend, former Cedarburg Alderman, Art Filter, has some cards that if any of you have questions that you would like to ask of the panelists. I know there's many of you here who possibly have some connection with the Fox Farms. So if you have questions, or we also want to involve the audience. If you have something that you want to say, please feel free. Just get my attention, or I might even come and ask some of you to make some comments. It's my pleasure then to introduce our panelists for today. And our panelists for today, if you saw the brochure, one of the people who was supposed to be here, who many of you know, Loyal Wells, Loyal had 5 bypasses about 2 weeks ago, so Loyal could not be here today. From what I gather from his daughter, speaking to her the other day, he's doing okay. And the other panelists, first of all, Art Filter Sr. Art Filter spent a number of years working for Herb Nieman on the Herb Nieman farm, and there's a lot of mementos over here that the panelists have bought, and a couple of things that Art brought along, the shovels that they used to dig the post with, and a few other things, and the hog rings. And so if you haven't noticed those things, please take some time later to do that. Roger Ron, who chastised me for putting his nickname in the paper, so I won't mention that. And Roger, again, like many other Cedarburg people in his younger years, worked on the Fox Farm. And Janet Bevrons, whose dad was, now Janet Bevron, whose dad was the general manager of Fromm Brothers and Nieman's, and Janet grew up close to the Fox Farms. Clarence Shorty Grossi, and Clarence worked for Herb Nieman, and then also spent some time in some of the other farms, and he'll have some interesting things to say as well. Dr. Howard Krieger, who spent, again, like many people did, his younger years working on the Fox Farms, and now a retired veterinarian living in Evansville, Wisconsin. And then Dr. Gordon Stevenson. Gordon's dad, Ron, was the proprietor of the Stevenson Farm, which now many of you know where Cedar Point is located. And Ron has some interesting things to tell us, some words of wisdom, I believe, Gordon, that your dad shared with you. So with that, and there's one other person here who I want to introduce, who it's just fabulous that he's here. Gary Mason and his wife, Sue. You want to stand, Gary? Gary and his wife are now the owners of the former Hamburg ranch or whatever it was called. Yes. And they brought along the box, and they brought some pictures, and they now are in the process of setting up tours of the old Hamburg facility. So there are some brochures there, and we'll have Gary share some things with us later on what what's going on at Hamburg and what's there. So we really thank them for coming down from Wausau, or the Wausau area, to be here today. Thanks a lot, Gary and Sue. Okay, with that, Art, I guess we can start off with you with some memories, or as we say, some stories about the what it was like on the Fox Farm. Okay. So we'll start with you, Art.
Okay, I was about 18 years old when I went over to the Fox Farm, and they gave me a shovel and a pick and post hole digger, and they said, get busy and work. And we did a lot of digging with trenches, for putting the wire in the ground. They had to put that in the ground so the foxes wouldn't dig out. And the yards were 40 by 40. So you dug those trenches. They're about 30 inches deep. They went up to your hip, and it's just wide enough so you could stand in it to get down to the bottom. You had a spade or you had a shovel. I got a shovel there that's a new shovel. It comes from Ames, Iowa. It's made that you can put your foot on the back of the shovel and for digging post holes. Today's shovels you can shovel gravel, but you can't dig no post holes, see. So that went down straight. So you got so much a trench, but it never amounted to more than 30 cents an hour, if you got a little. You dug about 3 trenches a day. If you had good digging, if you were lucky, you got 4, so then you made a little extra, see. But there was a lot of people that were working there doing them. And then after the trenches were dug, then they came to post holes. Now this is the time when there was no mechanical equipment. It was all shovels and picks. All them yards, and there was like thousands of acres of yards with posts. That was all put in by hand. A lot of people worked there. They had a lot of people working there on the Fox Farm, which gave them a lot of work. And after the post holes were put up, then the wire came. They put the wire around, And there was you had a shelf wire on top so the foxes couldn't get up. They hit that shelf wire, and then you had 2 rows of wire on the side. And they had to be all hog ringed. I got the hog ring pliers there with the hog rings. And boy, I tell you, you dug that all day. It finally got the big blister, and you had to bite your teeth every time you put that pliers together. And then the bottom, that was all hog ring too. So that was the part of the building, the Fox Farms. And the roads were about 12 foot wide, and then they had 5-foot spaces between each yard, to keep them apart. And the foxes, they would like to dig, and they'd be digging, and every once in a while they'd dig themselves out. If they were digging, you had to go in there and close the holes up or get them out, and sometimes they would be down 5 foot. They'd be in the next yard, but you had to get them out and close that hole up. I know guys held you by your feet, and you'd put a long stick in that foxhole, because they'd go about 8 or 10 feet, maybe 15 feet. And then foxes would make a little spot just about where they were, and you could find that, and you get them out of there and close the holes up again, see. So, and then after a while, we had a lot of people, young boys from high school come in, and in the summertime, then we started feeding the foxes, and we've had the dishes like we got over there, and they had to be washed. So there were probably a couple of thousand dishes that had to be washed, and they had to be sterilized, mind you, sterilized, the fox dishes. They were very fussy. And the feeders, which I was after a while, if you found a little meat in there, you put that dish on the side, and if you had maybe 5 or 10, you went back by the dishwashers and you told them, listen, you better do a better job. These dishes are dirty. So, and we fed a lot of fox meat. And you took care of about 250 yards. Then when you were a feeder, that was your job, and I worked there about 8 years. And you seen to it that they got fed and watered and mated and all this stuff. It was pretty nice work. And I see Herb Nieman is on there with the pelts, and he took us up there and grading pelts, so I know how that worked. The pelts, they were like a big gym like we in Cedarburg, the old gym, and the fox pelts were all hanging up there on a rack, and we slept underneath the tails, where they had, and then they brought them out, and then they put on a nice blue light. You had to shake the pelts and get the fur up there, and then they got put on piles, the better ones, and then the second one, and then the ones that weren't so good, and then they got shipped. This was up at Hermansville. And in the spring of the year, I went up there too with 2 other guys, and we had to catch those foxes and tattoo them. All foxes had tattoos in their ears. And the left ear, you probably got, like ours at Herb Nieman's, that was S Ranch. So you put you had a little wooden spoon with the tattoo needle or a thing, and it was on 2 dry cell batteries and some ink, and you put that in there. And then on the right ear, you put the yard. The yard had a number. And then if it was like 100, you put 100, and then with the pup, for the new pup, that was 101. And then number 102, that got in. So if a fox got out, you knew just exactly where he should go. And also on the records, they kept very good records. They put in how much they got for that fox pelt in New York. And in like 38 or so like that, there were prices of over $200 for the pelt that they got, see? So those were the kind of foxes that you wanted to keep and with the good quality and mate them foxes together. The same way with if the pair had only 3 young ones, they would get shipped out. You wanted to have an average of 4 or over. And maybe there was a good male, you kept the male then, see? But Herb Nieman, he wanted an average of 4, and if you made that, well, he was happy, see, so.
Now, Art, you said Hermansville. That's where Herb Nieman went. And then the Fromm brothers were at Hamburg, right? Here? Yeah. Okay. Just so we know the distinction between those.
Hermansville, that's up in Michigan, and those boxes there, there's 3 foxes going each side, and that cover slid, back and forward, and that was 6 foxes in a box. In a truck load that went up to Hermansville, at least from Ed Nieman's, there were 144 boxes on that semi. So that's like, I might be wrong, but 864 foxes, I'm thinking that's probably pretty close, see? And they were all, we had to load them up there, and then Clarence Caston, he used to drive, but he isn't here, he had company, but he drove one truck and drove that up to Hermansville. I don't know what road I would ask him what road he took, but that was a big place up there, and then they unloaded them, and the next day they come down again, and then the next day they'd ship again. They had, a couple of weeks of those trucks going up there, The reason for them to go up there was it was cooler up there. They got shipped like in September, and up in Michigan, upper Michigan, why it was cooler there, and they had better fur. And as I said, those boxes were all about 4 inches apart. That's so they wouldn't rub, you'd ruin the skin, see? And all the boxes, they had a lat over the top so they wouldn't move. And then, that was a pretty high truck. So that's about the story on that a little bit.
Okay. Thanks, Art. Mr. Ron.
Well, I thought Art was going to steal my opening story. I can remember the first day starting at the Fox Farm. We were down at the Fromm Brother up on top of the hill where the Mequon Golf Course is now, in the main building, and I was handed a pair of rubber boots. I was handed a rubber apron, and then I was walked into a room that had a great big tank on one side, and that thing was just piled full of dishes. And then they showed me a machine that was a brush that was basically, the brush was the size of the pan, and the thing was to put the pan on there and get it good and clean and then go around. Well, washing the pans wasn't so bad. It was once in a while grabbing into that big tank, getting a stack of fresh ones to wash, because some of them were pretty ripe. And as Art pointed out earlier, after they were washed, then they were pressurized, steam treated, and to keep them clean. But that's the way we started out, and I'll never forget, we got 35 cents an hour. After that, we were up there in the main building for a while, and after a while, we were sorted out to one of the kind of outlying areas, and at that time, we worked for Mr. Loyal Wells, and Dr. Krieger was one of my partners, and there was Jim Hickman was from Cedarburg here, Willie Volkman was from Cedarburg, Buddy Helm was from Thiensville. These are many names that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And at that, once we got over to the Loyals place, then the Loyals area rather, that's again, it would be the south or northeast corner of the Mequon Golf Course is where that was located. And then we did various things every day from, watering foxes was just basically like feeding. You had a team of horses pulling a wagon, a special built wagon. It had the large tanks on it, and then you would go to work and take your bucket, fill your bucket, stop at the next hut, or what we call the hut. It was a water hut. It was big enough for 2 pans. You'd snap open the snap, lift up the lid, put in the water. If it was really pretty cruddy, you'd take it and rinse it out and put fresh water in and go on to the next operation or to the next location that you were watering at. As the years went on, we got involved in a number of other things, not to get off the subject of foxes, but they did get into turkeys. They started raising some turkeys. The first year was successful. The second year, they increased the amount, but they had a very serious evening right after we took the turkeys off of the wire, put them on the ground. We had a very severe storm, and the turkeys all crowded up against the fence, and we had thousands of dead turkeys the next morning. Some of the other things we got into later on in the later years when we were there, I was there for the 4 summers through high school, and then the Frums went in and started to develop the dog food. A Dr. Roberts was brought in, and of course he was the dietitian that put these foods together, and then we had to feed a lot of that because every pen was marked exactly what batch of food was supposed to be fed to those foxes. So that's about all I have, unless somebody has some questions.
So it was really, it was a well done, well organized, very meticulous thing in terms of the feeding and, and the
Oh, yes.
proper
Yes.
stuff that the foxes would get.
When they would load the wagons for feeding, they were the same basic special wagons for that. They had the platform was quite low, and then they had tubs, big steel tubs of meat. There was food to be fed, and those tubs, if I remember correctly, weighed 250 pounds apiece. Most of the time, you just kind of dragged them and slid them into position, but as you went on, you had to change, put the empty one out and bring the next one forward. They had looked like almost a little coal shovel, but it was a more sturdy material, and that's what you used to dig out of the tub, put in the pan, and you look at the number, how many are in this pen? Okay, well, they get this much. Then you'd go and put that in the feeder box where the pans went in, which was separate from the water pans.
Okay. Janet, do you want to share some of your?
Well, I've got something to say about something Art, I think, forgot. I think he forgot that after they dug these big holes and put the wire in, they'd fill those holes with rocks. And those rocks today are, imagine, giving a lot of people that bought those lots, I think they're probably giving them a lot of trouble. Well, my favorite subject is in regard to this food that he's talking about, this horse meat. The main feed was made of horse meat. And these horses were brought in by railroad cars from out west, and they were wild. So the men would drive them up to the corral near the slaughterhouse. And when they'd get up to the corral, my brother and I and our friends would pick out horses that looked pretty good, and we would ride them. And then we'd have races on Saturday, our friends from Cedarburg. And if any of you are here, I'd like to know how you remember that. We'd have races, and the prizes were always penny candy. And we would take those horses and keep them. But anyway, then of course they had to be slaughtered. And one of my favorite memories is the slaughterhouse. These horses, if they were wild, would be driven into this big room, and they'd be shot at random, and of course then they'd fall and be butchered. Well, my brother and I would have our maid pack our lunch, and there was a window on the side of the slaughterhouse. So the men built us a platform, and we would stand and look through the window and watch them kill these horses. And of course, nobody could understand how we did it, but it was the only excitement we had. And we were only about 10 years old, so it was okay. But anyway, then of course, one of the horses, I remember they kept it, it had been a racehorse. And the men taught that horse to get down on its knees for me to get on because I was too little to get up on it. And they would crop it behind the knee, and the horse would get down on its knee. But we had a lot of fun doing that. And of course, the slaughtering was the top of our life at that time. But that's where the fox farm and what all the fox food came from were all these wild horses. So I guess that's all about the slaughterhouse.
Roger.
I'd just like to add the fellows that did the slaughtering was kind of a family deal. It was a father,
Sparers.
Melvin Sperber. Then it was followed by a son by the name of, Mike Sperber was the father. Mm-hmm. Melvin was the son. And then there was a second son by the name of Manfred, who later became fire chief down in Mequon. But it was a family rotation on the fellows that did the butchering there. And then when they were hung up, then a fellow from Cedarburg by the name of George Dowse used to break them down into quarters and halves and so forth, and so they could be handled to be fed into a machine called a hog that was like a super grinder. And George used to feed that, and that's how the meat got into the processing room for feeding to the foxes.
Yeah, Gordon.
I guess in those days, one could feel sanguine about the horse slaughter, right? But nowadays, things have changed so much. And so, because I remember those days to some degree, and I know my kids are abhorred by this, and yet it was our life. And it was our, how we got to go to school, actually.
Well, I think back in those days, it was recognized as a humane way of doing it.
Right.
They were shot. And these fellows that did the butchering, it was one shot to the temple, and down that horse would go, and it never knew it hit him.
You know, I have to confess, Gordon, as you bring that up, thinking in terms of the organizations today, in terms of, being humane toward animals, I thought, we may have some people who come forward and don't recognize the history of, how things were done, and not just the using the horses and bringing them in and using them for the feed, but also the idea of, killing the foxes and using the fur. That there's a lot of people today who wouldn't maybe work today like it did in those days.
Right. It's especially difficult because the fox is in the same family as the dog, as the Kennedy. So from a zoological perspective, so they're very similar in a lot of their behaviors. And so nowadays it'd be a lot tougher, but in those days it was business. It was a different way of looking at things.
And it really was inhuman the way they shot at those wild horses, because they shot at them at random. The horses that weren't wild, they would hold and shoot, but the others, they just shoot at it random.
I have to also confess that up until most recently, I really didn't know why Mule Hill was called Mule Hill. But now I know.
I might just elaborate on it just a bit. It's now what is used to be called Mule Hill, where it is today, but is the sledding hill on Highway 57 at the railroad crossing in Mequon. And but years ago, as Janet pointed out, they used to bring these horses and mules, wild horses, old horses, and they all came in by railroad car. They had a constructed chute there that they could simply run down the chute and go out into the field.
That's how that got its name.
Yes, Mule Hill.
Okay, Clarence.
I have a comment on
Or
that.
Howard, okay, go ahead.
I was going to avoid this subject, but as long as Janet brought this up, I had quite a different experience. When I was a very small boy, my father was a blacksmith horseshoer, and he'd go out to Farm Brothers Nieman shoeing horses. And my job was to chase flies, but then I'd wander around. And I wandered into the slaughterhouse, and I was just appalled at what was happening there. So I ran up to my father crying and telling him about this, and it's a fact of life. But every time that revolver went off, it was just like I got shot. Well, as I grew up and worked on the Fox farm, and I worked there many years and in the meat room and all over, one accepted this. It was a part of life, part of the food chain. And I think people would be appalled at some of the people today with the use of horses, but for this, but you know, that was an important ingredient in the food of the fox, and it was a necessary thing. The other thing, on commenting on what some of the previous people had said, you know, I always marveled at the miles and miles of fences there were on the Fox farm. And I'm glad to have met Art Filter, who put those fences in, and he's 88 years old, and he looks pretty darn good to me. But I did start working on the Fox farm with Roger, and I think we were about 12 years old. And I too started in the dishwashing room, and I was there about 2 days, and Loyal Wells needed somebody to cut thistles to keep the thistles from entwining in the fur of the fox. So I escaped that dish room fairly quickly, and I stayed on with Loyal, well, through high school and college, working for him summers, holiday vacations, and weekends. And I'm sorry that Loyal isn't here, because he would have insights into fox farming that the rest of us don't have. And but I am indebted to Loyal and to the Fox farm, and I think the Fox farm had a tremendous economic impact on this area. It certainly had an economic impact on me in that it paid for my education. And I wish a speedy recovery for Loyal.
Howard, was Loyal like the general manager? Well, Janet's dad was the general manager, but did Loyal have a specific area that he was responsible for?
Yeah, the Fox farm was, the entire Farm Brothers Fox farm was divided up into ranges, and as I recall it, Wells was one of the ranches. We call them ranches. Wells was one of the ranches, and the main ranch, the foreman there was a man by the name of McCulley. And there's Federal Fox Farm, that was, the foreman was a Besh. And then there was a Cedarburg Fox Farm, and Ernie Barentz was a foreman there. So Loyal was a foreman. And then each ranch was further divided up into blocks. And each block had a letter, A block, B block, so on. And that's what Art referred to. When the foxes were tattooed, they were tattooed A101 and a number of that fox. So they were readily identified. And then these blocks, well, these fences have always been a marvel to me, because these blocks were all secure areas in themselves. And then around the blocks, there was another fence that was all the way around. And these fences were, I would guess, 8 feet high, and they had a shelf on them. And all the way around all of these blocks, the entire Fox farm had another fence around it to escape or prevent escape of foxes. And I believe on the inside of that, there was a wooden fence that surrounded all of Farm Brothers Nieman. And it was called the board fence. And when you went in there, you had a lot of gates to open up. It was a very secure operation as far as the escape of foxes.
There really isn't an awful lot left as far as like any of the pens or the fences and that stuff. The federal barns are still there, Roger, right? That's where
Yes.
we had the picture taken on Green Bay Road.
That's right.
And then I think, now Clarence and Art, you guys work for Herb, I think, and I think the barn on Wauwatosa Road just north of Mequon Road was part of
Right.
Herb's operation, and that whole Solar Heights subdivision was really part of the Herb Nieman operation.
That was where the trucks were loaded for shipping up to Hermansville, Michigan.
Okay, Clarence, you got the stage.
Oh, okay.
Your
Well, Ready? Okay.
Sure, anytime you're ready.
Okay, I started out at Cedarburg Fox Farm under Henry Drashevsky, and I worked there for 3 summers. And there was probably a dozen good football players at that time. And if you were in the point of sports, you had no trouble getting all the weightlifting that you wanted. And many, many times, the first thing we did when we got out there was clean kennels. Well, that took at least a good month and a half, and because there's a lot of kennels in a block, and those kennels are roughly 5 feet. I would think they're almost 5 feet square, and then they had a shelf in between on top and one on the bottom, and when you open up these roofs, there was a 2x4 in there that you could prop up to hold that heavy roof. And then there was a cover over that was in a barrel. You had to be kind of careful when you opened that cover up. A kind of Ma and Pa Kettle were in there with the kids, and they didn't like the idea of you snooping around, and you had to be pretty careful so that they wouldn't nip you in the face. And once you made your entryway into the kennel, or into the barrel, they were under the kennel and they would get you in the legs. So it was a losing battle all the way around, but that's why most of us all wore high 13-inch boots to accommodate that idea. And after cleaning kennels, then we all drew straws, all of us high school kids, and who was going to do what? Because it wasn't fair for one person to sit there and do dishes for a constant summer. And so some of us we'd pulled straws for our jobs, and it was very acceptable to the boss. And some of us would go to Cedarburg with the truck and unload bran from the railroad cars that would come in, because that was one of the main ingredients for the food. And some of us would be chaining. Cedarburg Fox Farm was noted for that, for breaking land for raising crop, hay and oats for the horses. And two young kids would go along out with the old fellas that would be driving the tractors, and they showed us how to hook a chain around something so it wouldn't slip off. And that's what you did all day, from one little tree to the next little tree. And we cleaned off a lot of acreage that way, and we had also raised some wonderful crops, and hay galore, oh, heavenly days. And when it was baling time, two guys would sit on the back end of one of them old case balers, and they would be poking wires in, and the other one would poke the wire in, the other one would be tying that wire, and then the guy that would just spit the bales right out on the ground, and those were full 100-pound bales, and two guys would grab a hay fork, a 3-tined hay fork, and they would pitch them on the wagon like that. And you do that all day long. You don't have to do calisthenics. And
Clarence,
Well-
I don't want to interrupt you, but when you say the Cedarburg Ranch, okay, and I know Hank Drashevsky, I think, was superintendent, and I think Ruth is here today, his daughter. Where was that located? Was that what eventually became the Stevenson?
No.
Oh, no, they were separate. Where was the Cedarburg Ranch located, Clarence?
Cedar
I
Creek.
really don't know.
Cedar Creek Road. I and Cedar Creek.
Oh, okay, north. Okay, where Sherwood.
If the Cedar Creek would go through, the creek is right there.
Okay,
Covered Bridge Park is coming in from the opposite side.
where the Sherwood Forest subdivision is
Right,
now, or that's what.
right.
Okay, just to clarify that.
Yep. And, well, then next big job was, after that job was over, then they gave us a big job of tattooing. Well, Art told a lot about tattooing already, and each animal had to be caught, all the pups had to be caught because Ma and Pa already had their numbers in their ears. And we tattooed, like Art said, the block number and the yard number and section number. That was all recorded so that when you caught a fox on the outside, you knew exactly where that animal belonged. And so then when we were tattooing, before we'd catch all these animals, and then we would you grab them by the tail, possible, and you'd slide your hand up their back to their head and kind of grab so that you take his nose and his mouth together, and so his little sharp teeth won't hurt you anymore. And then with the other hand, you'd grab for all four legs, and you held him, and he was helpless, so he had to take that little buzzing in his ear if he liked it or not. And they cut their cords, their toe cords, just like they do for cats, and so they were all done digging after that point of the picture. And then before we'd release them, there was a can of powder, and they would powder each animal, believe this or not, with DDT, and which is highly isn't used anymore. And that took care of all the fleas and the lice and everything else that was on them animals. So I believe at that time we got something like, Roger said, 45 cents an hour you got?
We started at 35, but the next year we got moved up to 45.
Well, I think we started with 45 and worked up to 65.
Well, maybe I was in the wrong place.
Art brought a pay stub along that he had from, when was that, Art? When was that pay stub from, Art?
Pardon?
When was your pay stub from?
My check or?
Yeah, your check stub, yeah.
52.5 cents an hour. That was feeder, for being a feeder. That was a top job to be a feeder, you know, that you could. They paid you 52.5 cents an hour, and you got a raise every once in a while with 2.5 cents. That was a quarter a day because you work 10 hours a day. I got my worksheet over there. You work 10 hours a day every day, Saturdays, and 4 hours for Sundays. And then it got to be April when we started feeding with pans, then they gave you 5 hours of pay. Well, you had it in the morning, you picked up the pans before you went to church. Sometimes I took Frida along, she helped me. Picked up the pans, and then you went and unhooked the horse. Then you went to church. And then after 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, then the meat would be there. Then you had to go out and feed them. So it was okay. I mean, you didn't have a lot of spare time. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about them horses, because, you know, where did them horses come from? A lot of people don't know. Well, this was like in the 1924, and they got a lot of mules in at first, and they were put up there, and that's why it was called Mule Hill. There were a lot of mules there. Then they also had, by the church down there, what's the name of that church there on Highland Road, you know, by
Crossroads Presbyterian.
Crossroads, where that parking lot is, they had a big fence there. They had horses in there. And my dad had a horse, he had a couple of horses, but this one was ready for a fox farm. So he hitched the tub buggy up, put the horse in the back, and he rode down the road, and he says, I'm taking him to the fox farm, which was over by Federal Foods, see. And okay, he come back, and we felt sad about the horse, you know. You know how you get attached to him. But the next morning, he heard some noise down by the barn. Here stands the horse. Well, you know, the fencing wasn't too good. You know, page wire fence, and the horses had been reaching over, you know, and getting the greener grass on the other side, you know. So Dad had to hitch up the buggy once more and take the horse back, and when he went over, they said, well, we'll take care of him right now. So that was the end of that. But getting back to these horses, you know, most of them came from the south and most of them from the west. You see, in the 24s or close, you know, 25, 26, when these big farms got mechanized, they all had 12 or 14 or 16 horses out there on these big farms. So they had to get rid of those horses. So that's where the horses mostly came from, out west. There were some mules in there, but not many, because I seen the horses that came in by Herb Nieman down there. Their slaughterhouse was over there when you go on the Mecklen Road by the old brewery there, and you go in by the school that way, you know, see. They had 3 butchers there. And they could butcher about 20 horses a day, and that was quite a job. But they, as you say, they brought in 3 horses. Each one got a bullet, and then while they skinned them, and that skinning went 1, 2, 3. You know, they skinned the head and the legs and the belly, and then they put a cable on the ears, and they pulled the hide right out up to the tail, and it was 1, 2, 3. That horse was skinned. I don't like to talk about it, but I was working right there where they were. The guys that were butchers, they'd sit on the horse and eat their sandwiches, and I was kind of young there, you know, and I'd eat my sandwich, and once in a while I thought, are there any raisins in this bread? So I had to be a little careful, you know, and I'm telling you, you had to do a little swallowing to eat that sandwich, because in the summertime, those flies were thick. But I wanted to mention that because that's where the horses came from, you know, and they paid about 6 cents a pound. That's what they told me, you know, see, so it was pretty cheap meat, you know, see, and that's why later on they had to go more to different food, you know, they didn't get the horse meat anymore, and those butcher shops the butchers took care of Stevenson's and then Orlando Nieman. So there were 3 big places, and they slaughtered a lot of horses. And if I took a load of meat out, it was over a ton of meat, you know, about 2,400 pounds, like 250 pounds in a tub, and you had you had about 13 tubs that you fed, you know, see. And when you had a fox pair with 6, 7, or 8 foxes, you had to fill that dish up pretty big, you know, see. And if the dish was pulled out the next morning, which you didn't like, was then you had to run in the yard and pick it up, you know, see. That meant they were a little hungry. You had to give them a little more.
Okay. Howard, any more to...
I think I introduced myself, I think.
Okay. Okay, Gordon.
Well, I have a little different history here because I was a kid when these guys were working so hard. I was born in 41, And of course, as a kid, I lived on the farm for the first 6 years, and then we moved to the city on Washington Avenue. But I lived near Evergreen and Western Avenue, in a big yellow house there. And of course, when I was a kid, I remember how much fun it was, especially catching the foxes. As Clarence talked about, it was a real kick to get in that pen and have the fox run past you and try to grab its tail, and then hold it far enough away. Its tail is not muscular enough for it to pull itself up, so you could take it over and bring it to the kennel, and it would want to go in the kennel because it was a safe place. That's really its den, and that's when you could follow what Clarence said about running your hand up and catching the neck and hoping that the fox didn't catch any part of you. I didn't know about the details of the tattoos and so forth, but the tattoos were critical to this business. I think, Art, you mentioned about tracking the animals. That's to track the genetics, because you wanted to know the price of pelt brought later so you could go back to that family and keep on breeding them, especially if they had the right kit count or pup count or cub count. It's a different word depending upon where you read. A lot of the things that have been mentioned lead to knowing something about the actual biology of the fox. And they've caught these initial silver strain foxes between 1900 and 1920. And there was a family, I think on Prince Edward Island, that actually got the strain to breed true. The silver fox is part of a whole set of subspecies of the red fox. 7 are red, 1's dark, and 1's the silver. And they kept on working on that silver fox to make sure it would breed true, and that meant they had to have good record keeping. The records were kept ultimately on punch cards. And the old IBM kind of punch cards were first done by key sorting the cards with wires so they could track the families and pull out pricing and pull out lineage and all this other kind of information. It was a major part of the whole story. It was keeping those tattoos. That's why you wanted to know where they came from, because if a fox got out of the pen and then got out into the large yards, but you could still catch it, you wanted to put it back exactly where it came from in order to keep those records clean. So the records were critical to the whole industry. That also became true in the mink industry. And mink didn't have big enough ears, and so they would, usually if a mink got out, they'd just harvest, is how they called it, harvest the mink the next winter because it was, the genetic strain was lost. Fur-bearing animals require really careful record keeping. You might have wondered, why is there a double hut? Some of the pictures over there show the 2 huts, part of the fox houses. Foxes in the wild usually have at least 2 dens. One's a decoy den, and one is the den they happen to be living in. So there are pictures that we have of mothers taking their cubs from one side to the other side, moving the whole family over to the other side. There also might have been a reason in the wild to get a fresh den to cut the parasite count. As you mentioned with the DDT, parasites can be a major problem, especially on later on. The lice were a major problem. In fact, my father hired a young PhD in entomology who came to work on our farm. George Quito was his name. And he was brought specifically to develop more effective methods for treating the lice. Later in his career, George Quito became a professor of entomology at the University of Wisconsin, and he recently stopped by to visit my sister Carol, who lives still in town here, just to say hi, he and his wife Ruth. But there was lots of research going on at the fox farm. In fact, in my dad's part of it, in his office, there were all kinds of chemical reagents and special scales to measure the fat content of the food and to track the vitamin content. It became critical with the mink later on. Foxes are omnivores. They'll eat anything, including grass. And so later on, meal and fish was put into the fox food because the horse supply was dwindling. In the case of the mink, it's a strict carnivore, and so you had to be sure that everything you fed it was adequate for its needs, especially vitamins. So a lot of that research was done through students at the University of Wisconsin who would come over and live with us and do the research right on the farm. Another problem was the endocrinology. At the time that you guys were reviewing, the belief was that the foxes had to be moved to the North Country for the development and full priming of their fur. It also might have made them more robust, running free and so forth. But it turns out that most of that's controlled through the pituitary gland, and the shortening days of fall are changing the endocrinology, and now they can raise foxes or mink in the southern part of the country without ever moving them anywhere. And as the light changes, of course you can't go too far south, because you do need the light change to kick in the change in the endocrinology. A tremendous amount has been learned about foxes and about dogs and about cats from initially the fox industry. Distemper serum, for example, was developed from laboratories. Is it off of Green Bay Road or over in that area somewhere?
Lakefield.
Lakefield. They developed it first for foxes because it was a major killer of the foxes. And if the foxes died before they were ready for market, you didn't get very much money for the labor that had gone in that far. Later on, it was also adapted to dogs, which I mentioned are a relative of the foxes, very close relative, and later to cats, which are a similar relative. So you probably guessed, my background is zoology, and my PhD is in zoology, and I probably got that start from living at the fox farm and having men like George Guido help dissect a frog or other things that weren't really related to foxes but were much more interesting. Catching the foxes probably was like you with the horses, that was my high, getting in that pen and chasing them around and being able to ride with the guys on the truck, or in the first days with the horses and the wagons. And later on, we replaced them after the war with jeeps and trucks, because the one less thing to care for, basically, except for the truck was a problem. Hermansville was used all the way through, I think, until kind of the demise of the fox industry. There's still some foxes out there, but the main reason that the industry lost tremendous sales was after the war, the government was needing money, and they put an excise tax on all garments, not only fully furred garments, but all garments trimmed with fur, a 20% excise tax. And it just killed the market. And styles had gone from the chubbies, full jackets, to more trim and scarves. And this tax really hurt the whole industry. I think at one time between the Frums and the Niemans, they were producing 100,000 foxes a year. Yeah. This truly was the world center for the production of foxes. But that whole industry went away, and mink moved in and took its place. And most of the same people were involved in the mink industry.
Well, Gordon, I can add something to that. When the fox industry really went out, it was a lot of problems because Norway was bringing in a lot of foxes a lot cheaper. And it turned out that Norway had bought a lot of breeders from Fromm Brothers someplace along the way. And so these foxes were brought into New York to the auction house. And Norway was getting cheaper prices than Fromm's were. So all these fox garments and everything, first of all, the fox pelts were sold at auction. Then Fromm Brothers had a beautiful store or a showroom in New York where they had all kinds of garments made up with fox trim. And these garments were sold at that point. But then all of a sudden, people wouldn't wear fox clothes. Well, now they say that Norway is bringing in foxes, and the fox industry is picking up considerably. And I have one little thing to tell you here. It took, I better get this straight, it took 18 fox pelts to make a coat. Now, that was why fox coats were so expensive, because it took 18 pelts just to make one coat. And it took 45 to 70 mink pelts to make a coat. So that explains the cost of your mink, because these had to all be skinned and taken to the auction and then sold on the auction block.
I
But
can
now
tell you,
it's coming back.
I can tell you that when we were growing up and working on the farm, my dad required that the boys start working at 12. Oh, by the way, I started at 65 cents an hour. Just thought,
Guess I was the wrong place.
but I didn't start till I was born in 41, so I probably didn't start till 53. But the job was just as difficult, but it was great for building the muscles for football, as you mentioned, Clarence. It really was heavy work. And as a 12-year-old, I worked from 7 o'clock in the morning till noon. We had an hour off for lunch. And then we worked from 1 till 6 all summer long, not during the school year. And I learned a tremendous amount from the other people working there. Things like, I learned quite a vocabulary, first of all. And a lot of it was in German, and I didn't know what it meant, but I could say it correctly. So I have been corrected on some of those kinds of usage. I wanted to mention one thing about the digging of the holes that a number of you have talked about. When my father, who had a research background, he was a metallurgical engineer and off to work in blast furnaces and such, but he married this lovely young woman, the only daughter of John Frederick Nieman, and John Frederick worked very hard to get him to join the business because he really was headed for a research career in metals. When he came to Cedarburg rather, he started to notice certain things. His background was research, and one of the things was digging holes on Sunday afternoons to find the foxes and plug them up with the sticks and the stones. And he was the one who said, why don't we just cut the ligaments to the claws? And at first there was big resistance because it was going to make the foxes lame and it would hurt the fur and so forth. He said, well, let's just try a few. Again, an experiment. And it turned out there was no damage at all, and so pretty soon it went throughout the industry as that's one way to deal with raising getting Sunday afternoons free with your family and taking a break once in a while.
That cutting of the cords was a very sharp little knife. It had a little bit of a hook, and all they did was cut the initial tendon, and the nail would automatically go up, and therefore they couldn't dig. They were given a good shot of alcohol on the cut, and that was the end of it on that. There also was the various colors. We've been always talking silver fox here. There was the silvers, of course, then there was red fox, who were basically wild. Then there was what we call the platinum fox. That was the one that came out with a kind of a white and brown. And then there was also a small batch of Arctic fox, the blue fox. And those little guys are really tricky. They look, when they're real small, they look like the cutest little cuddly bunny you want to do. And one day I went to one close to my face, and the next thing I knew, I was standing there with a fox hanging on my nose.
Howard.
That blue fox, it was an interesting fox. You mentioned about holding a fox out by his tail like this and getting it by the neck. A blue fox you couldn't do that with. A blue fox was able to turn up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The only way you could catch a blue fox is to take a metal crotch, or we called it a crotch, and it was a metal fork that you went into the pen and penned them down to get them. But they were really athletic. And Roger also mentions platinum fox, and you mentioned the genetics of the fox. That got to be a rather big thing probably when we were seniors in high school. They started polygamous matings. And they got away from these ground pens, and they put them in raised wire pens. Sanitation for one thing, but I think the economics more concentrated. But they started going to polygamous matings, whereby they'd have observation towers, and then they'd observe these females for estrus, and then they'd take them into the males, and they'd mate, and then we'd take the fox out of there. 2 days later, we'd put them back in and mate again, and then it was considered a good mate. But at any rate, these platinum fox, I believe, Roger, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of those pairs were going for over $4,000. They were very expensive. Breeding stock, yes,
yeah.
breeding stock.
I believe Howie's right on the money with that money market, but our money amount. But I noticed on the pictures over there, I believe there's a picture of one on the table over there of a platinum.
Platinum,
fox.
yeah.
If you look carefully at the picture, you may see that the hair color comes from two kinds of hair. There's the outer guard hairs, which are longer and often produce the white,
Yes.
against the underfur, which is a dark, like black almost. And it's the combination of the two that give the full effect of the fur and its luster and so forth. And there are different sets of genes that control those. So they started to learn about, this is the old kind of genetics. You just didn't take a blood sample and run a DNA test in those days. You actually had to follow the families through and see what the effects were on litter size and market price later on. So it took a few generations to do the tracing of the best lines.
Then there was also the freak line of the monkey fox. He was as wide as he was long. And they were real gentle. You could almost have them. I know we had one that we used to ride in a truck with us once in a while when we were getting a load of meat or something.
It was called a monkey fox?
A monkey. They referred to him as monkey fox. They were
I think it
short,
was.
short-bodied, but they were much wider.
Is a genetic defect.
Yeah,
Oh.
that's all it was a
Well,
oddball.
the reason I'm interested is that my PhD research was on monkeys, and maybe that's where that came from.
I have a favorite story to tell about the fox and the personality of a fox. I was feeding with, we fed in pairs, one guy on each side of the wagon, and I was feeding with Elmer Schultz. And I'd play with this, we were feeding in raised pens, and every day I'd play with this fox. He'd always come up and play with my finger, you know. And one day I told Elmer, hey, Elmer, I got a tame fox over here. Look at this. I put my finger in there and wham, he had me.
I was going to add one note about the pans that you diligently washed.
Yes.
It may be, I'm guessing on this, I don't know for sure, but certain kinds of diseases like botulism can start with the rotten meat. And it may be that they were super sensitive to having any foxes die because of an outbreak of botulism. And at that time, they didn't have a serum to inject to protect against it. So they had to be ultra secure about the dishes they were giving them. And later on, I saw them just throw the whole feed over the fence line, and the fox would find it out in the yard someplace.
But some of those pans would come in where the food was now all completely eaten, and it was getting hard, and it had been exposed to maybe 8-10 hours of sunlight, and they got pretty ripe.
How old did the foxes have to be before you took the pellets?
Harvested. Before you harvested them, is that what you mean?
Harvested, yeah.
Yeah. We always learned the word harvesting very early. I have sisters, and we had to talk about this at the dinner table, so it was always harvesting. But usually, most of the foxes were probably less than a year old, probably in their first year. And then you kept the breeding stock. Foxes can live 12, 15 years in the wild. You probably didn't keep them that long on the farms. But most of them were less than a year old. They were, the matings correct me, but they were in the winter or?
In March.
March? Oh, they were in
In
March.
March and January, the old ones, foxes, the young ones, got them in March.
Okay.
March 5th or 7th, early in March, you see. And they got to be about 4 weeks old. 4 weeks old. Then we had to give them a worm pill.
Right.
They all got a worm pill. Then we waited 10 days. We went around again and gave them a worm pill. He had a great big thing, put the little pill in there and put it in their mouth, And the young ones, from last year, they had the young ones like in May, end of April. And those foxes, if they were about 4 weeks old, they came out of the kennels starting to look, or else the mother would lay a little meat on an incline and they'd come out, see. But the old ones always, about the first part of March, that's when they went. Now, Herb Nieman had us look for the young ones on April 10th. That was April 10th. That was his day when you could go look through the old pairs, because he wanted to know how many young ones there were, see. And that was I tell you, that was a bad thing to do. Sometimes it was so cold, about 10 above. Got colder years ago, I'm talking in the 30s, And it's not like now, and old mother would take that one from this kennel to the next kennel and that way around, and they probably were just born, see, so we said, well, listen, we know when that fox has got its young ones, when they're starting to carry meat. Then we'll look at it, and which we did then, we forgot about that April 10th. But then in May, well, you just knew when the mother would come out and carry meat, see. But I do want to mention one other thing from the food. We used to get semis of smelt. I don't know if you know that. They brought that in from up by Green Bay there. When the smelt there were a lot of smelt. They come in, back this big semi in and loaded it up in the smelt all on the floor. And then they got put in pans, and then we boiled them, and then that's where they got the fish from. And the same way, like on a Tuesday, they come in with a semi with old bread. And that got dumped on the floor.
I remember that.
And then I know Alice's grandma, Alice Dietrich's grandma sat there. They had to take all the wrappers off the bread. And sometimes we helped too. And then the wrappers would get put in a boiler, burnt, Sometimes there was some nice donuts in there. They come in pretty handy, see. And, well, that's one thing. That's where Mr. Daling lost his fingers or his hand at that time. We was grinding up this bread on a big corn blower, see. And well, that thing was full of donuts and stuff like that, sticky stuff, and he fed it too much, and it clogged up. So then they had to stop it, and there were two doors, one at the bottom and one on top. And he cleaned that out and moved that big blower around, and it was clean, see? So then he started it up, but Mr. Daling forgot to close the little door, and the bread started coming flying out. And the boss says, close that door, instead of shutting the machine off. So Milton, he reached around like this. There was only this much room between the wall, and the blower. Reached around, put his hand right into the hole, cut it off. That was, yeah.
If somebody asked a question relating to the horses, was the whole horse basically, did they use, like they say about the pigs, they use everything except the oink?
Yeah.
Did they do that with the horses, Clarence?
Yes, they used everything but the hide, the hoofs, and the intestines. A truck would come out from Milwaukee and come out and pick that up, and that's the only part that was not used for horse meat. The meat was shaved off the bones just as if you were cleaning up a steer. And then they had a big grinder that took all the bones, everything. There was nothing wasted. And a lot of times Herb Nieman had it made with a canning factory here in Cedarburg. And when there'd be not a perfect batch of peas or something that were off color or they were over the hill, instead of canning them, they would keep them on the side, and they'd take them down to Mequon and freeze them. And this was all mixed in with the food as we went along, with the smelt, everything. And
I don't know if everybody knows all the connections here, but the Frum brothers and the Niemans were double cousins. Frum, the generation before, had married a Nieman, and vice versa. So they were cousins, they knew each other. The Frums had the foxes, and my grandfather, John Nieman, had made pretty good money in a store and banking, and they got together, and that's how they financed this. So when they talk about Herb Nieman, that was my Uncle Herb, and Uncle Ed owned where the Mequon Gulf in the hill that you're talking about, where we used to sled. And then John was the third son. My mother was the third child, I think, in the family. It turns out that the canning factory he's talking about was also started by John Nieman, and the one down in Thiensville was part of the Milwaukee River Canning Company, I believe. And so these were all connected. They all tried to, it's all interconnecting companies, partly by the fur, partly by the canning. They had a lot of things going in this area. It was a pretty interesting family to be born into. And of course, my dad said, none of you are going into this business. So none of us did. We all.
Can I ask a question? Do any of you have any idea how many people worked for Fromm Brothers? I heard the other day that they at one time hired a lot of prisoners of war. It must have been during some war. Does
World
anybody
War II.
remember that?
World War II.
World War II, Howard, go ahead.
That's really the reason I consented to come on this panel today. Initially I was declining coming on here, but in speaking to Palmer and Harvey, who were in the service at that time, they were not aware that German prisoners had worked on the Fox farm. And that's very true. I can remember an Army bus coming into our yard, and there was a building we called a garage. It was like a 4 or 5 car garage. It had picnic tables set up in it, and this bus would unload German prisoners. And 4, 5, 6 of them would go to work with us out in the block, catching fox, vaccinating, worming, so on, feeding. I don't think they ever fed. But, and another 5 or 6 would go across the road to the mink farm, and that bus would go on, and I think it went out to the Cedarburg Fox farm and dropped somebody off at the Cedarburg Fox farm. But then they'd work with us all morning, and then at noon they'd come back in, and they'd all have dinner in this garage. And then they'd go back out and come back in at 5 o'clock at night and leave. I do not know where they stayed. The prisoners were also working in the canneries. That was probably the connection between the Niemans and the canneries, but the German prisoners also worked in the canneries. And I really don't know where they stayed. For some reason, I think it was Richfield, but I'm not sure of that. But at any rate, these men had worked with us all day, and it worked out really very well because all of the men spoke German, so it was no problem. And I think these people were screened. There were no Nazis in them. They were decent sort of people. I don't ever remember having a guard go out with us into the block to work, but occasionally we'd see someone on the bus. But other than that, that's true. We had a lot of German prisoners working there.
Roger,
Howie, I think some of those prisoners were stationed down at the House of Correction in Milwaukee, or down on the north side of Milwaukee, and then some of them came out of Mitchell Field in a big truck, and a lot of them were very down-to-earth fellows. They were willing to do a day's work. I remember I had one that I got quite acquainted with, and he claimed to be a wild tiger lion trainer in his country. And I also remember that on VE Day, a case of beer around the Fox farm was pretty common, and they all had a bottle of beer, and the guard got a little upset, but he had one too, so that evened the score.
Well, Jean Ernest was telling me that she remembers them reupholstering some furniture. One of them was a real good upholsterer, and after hours he'd do the upholstering for people. And when you think about it, almost all of Ozaukee County must have been working for Fromm Brothers and the branches, because that was one of the biggest employers in the county. And at my father's funeral, everybody that came, they knew who I was from being a little girl, and they all thanked us for my father giving them work during that time, because they said it kept their families from dying. They got, they made enough money with their 30 cents an hour. They made enough money that they kept their families in food.
Glenn Hoffman is here, and I talked to Glenn last night, and Glenn's dad evidently drove. Glenn, you want to come up and tell people what you told me as far as your dad driving prisoners from Mitchell Field?
Yeah, my father hauled the prisoners from Mitchell Field. They had a big barracks down there, and I would have to guess that there had to be better than 70 of the prisoners that they hauled out daily, because Harold Woodworth took the bus down, and my dad took the big truck, which was pretty much like that. I believe that's the white shown on the picture over there, and they had a tarp over the top, and so the prisoners were hauled in the back of the truck. So they'd bring them out in the morning, and they'd haul them back in the evening. So I guess there were quite a few of them working down there.
Wasn't there a cannery at Richfield too? Isn't there a cannery there that they would have, Skippy? Yeah. Or Rockfield, I mean, not Richfield, at Rockfield. Yeah, right along the railroad tracks in Rockfield.
Rockfield.
Yeah. I'd like to introduce Gary Mason to you. Gary now and his wife, as I said before, are the owners of the ranch at Hamburg. And Gary, if you just want to tell people what's going on at Hamburg and what's there. And
Okay, first of all, I graduated from Cedarburg High School, so some people I know, I remember Gordy was a couple years ahead of me. I graduated in '62. So, but 7 years ago, we were looking for some hunting land, and some land in Hamburg became available, and we bought it, and on that was a clubhouse made out of hardwood logs with a 4-lane bowling alley in it, a boarding house. It has a slaughterhouse there where the auctions were held from 1936 to about 39 or 40. And what we're doing with that now is turning it into a museum for the fox and the mink industry and the ginseng. Ginseng is where the brothers got their money to get into fox. And there's brochures over there that you may want to pick up on what we're trying to do. There's going to be tours and corporate retreat center there. And if anybody has any pictures they would like to copy or let us copy, we're trying to get all the memorabilia we can. And any questions we can answer. One thing, we had somebody ask how the Fromms became connected with the Niemans. The brother's mother was Alwina Nieman. That's where the connection there came from. So that's pretty much it. Any questions? Stop me on the side.
thanks, Gary. And Gary and his wife drove all the way down from near Wausau today so that they could be here and bring the information with them. And that's really super and tremendous. Panel, any more comments? Clarence?
Yeah, I got some more to say on this big ordeal. After I left the Cedarburg Fox Farm, then I went down to Schultz's Fox Farm, which is off of Mequon Road, and that's where my dad worked. And he was a feeder, and like Art told you people that he was in charge of several blocks of foxes, and I really don't know offhand how many yards were in a block, but there was quite a few. And it was up to him. He could do this on the side as a bonus for the end of the year. He could go in and he could match the foxes for pairs, and to get a better quality, and it was for a better match and quality, and then at the end of the year, those foxes, it took several years before they actually got someplace on this, and to get a true silver and go from there to a platinum. And I believe that the feeders had that set aside for themselves, and what they performed that was going to be, those pelts would be set aside, and that was going to be their bonus for that year. And over and above their salary, which wasn't too much. And then over on the Wauwatosa Road by Harvey Sager's place, that was where the trucks were loaded for Hermansville, Michigan. And every day a truck would be backed in there, and we were all there, and we had to carry them heavy boxes onto the truck and set them, like Art says, 4 inches apart so that the animals would get plenty of air on their way up. And then this went on for, I would say, pretty close to a month of shipping.
Yeah.
And then back here when they were still putting up these yards, a couple of my uncles got a job. And one of them, my Uncle Irvin from Wabika, he had a job of measuring and marking posts. Every post had to be the same height and the same length. I said, what would be wrong with keeping a couple shorter posts in case you hit a stone almost to the bottom? And no, that stone had to come out. But that was his job. And then my uncle from, my other uncle, he was digging post holes for 10 cents a hole. And he would dig roughly 40 holes a day if digging was good. And that would be $4 a day. I think that he earned his money, really. And then back in 1936 and in 47, when we had the bad snow, then they hired all kinds of help to dig out the shelf wire on the pens so the foxes would stay in the area. And because they lost so many foxes, went over the fence, and they trapped most of them back again, but they had to bait them with meat after they were out for that length of time. They were hungry. They wanted to come home. And the outside didn't look as good as it did from the opposite way around. And then back in the late 40s, then the word came down from headquarters that it was time to go out with tubs on the wagon and kill the puppies. And the honest to God, that was the last straw. You should have seen the feeders like Art and everybody else. They almost cried when they had to go out and kill all the puppies. And I said, that was it. That was the end of my working. I was done. My dad quit. There were so many feeders that left, they couldn't take it.
Art, go ahead.
I gotta tell you about those foxes. When they had young ones, you had to have a lot of guts to go in that yard, because that mother would come out right up to you. And I worked over by Johnny, that's on where Girox garage is there. He needed someone to close the holes in the yard, so they said, Art, you better go over there for a couple of weeks. And there was a female there that had 7 young ones. And you no more than stepped in that gate, that fox was about 8 feet in front of you. But you had to close those holes, because every night they were digging it out. The whole family was digging. So I had my shovel, like I got over there, and I held that in front of me. I held it by the blade, and I kept going back and forward like this, and she went back and forward, you know. And finally I went that way, and I come back and hit her right on the side of the head. Well, she fell over, and I said, boy, I tell you, I hope you ain't dead, because there goes my job. So she struggled a little bit, and then after a while, a couple of hours later, I went back there. I see her still going around, and she was all right, so I felt pretty good. But you had to be, and catching these foxes, you had to be fast. And as like Clarence says, you know, these young guys from high school, you know, they didn't know what to do. So we'd crawl under the kennel and grab their leg. And they'd jump up, you know, they'd pretty run out of the yard. So it was a lot of fun there too, you know. But you had to be fast. You get in there and they'd go like that. But chances are, if you seen the tail, you went in and pulled them out and you had them, you know. See, so you got bit a few times. It's like you said, hold one in one hand, and I did that, and I grabbed another one in the other hand, and I left that one down a little too low, and he hit the ground, and he bit me in the leg. So I figured, well, you got to keep them up a little bit more.
I think we all got some little
Yeah.
tooth marks here and there on our hands and arms, and going back to the tattooing thing, well, you were sitting holding the fox in a position similar to this. You had the jaw in your hand, the paddle was here with the needle, and on a hot sunny day, and you'd hear the buzz of that needle, all of a sudden you'd donned a little bit, and all of a sudden, beep, you'd get one on the arm. So I got a couple dots here myself. And Dr. Krieger indicated that he's got a few on his leg, too.
Okay, I think with that, we're just about on time to thank the panelists. And Gordon has a DVD. There was a film made about the fox industry, and Gordon was able to take that film and to convert it to a DVD, and he has that. We don't have the capabilities to project it. So what we're going to do is when we're done, Fred's going to get set up with the TV set, and we'll put the DVD in, and then Gordon can, there's no narration with it, right, Gordon? So,
Right.
so Gordon can, you know, stick around, and Gordon can narrate that. We usually go about this time and then break up and have you, you know, deal with the participants to discuss things with them, and we'll take a little break, and then we'll set up the DVD. Skippy has something to add. Now this should be interesting.
Could I make just a quick?
Sure, Gordon. Sure,
Just
sure.
a quick correction. Actually, the film was made by my dad, who was an amateur photographer and also a pilot. So some of it shows the ranges of the fox yards over and over, all around Mequon from the air. And then he takes you on a trip north to Hermansville and shows the whole harvesting process, as we might call it. Shows you step by step the animals being released into the large furring ranges and letting them run, and then the guys moving them down the path finally to their last encounter with humans, and then finally they're skinned and so forth. It's all on the DVD. I have to take no credit. My sister is the one who had the movie made into a DVD and informed me that she had this, and I was delighted. We just didn't know what it was about because there was no narration. So I've written a narration.
Okay.
I have a few handouts if anybody is interested.
Okay. So we'll Skippy.
I heard no mention of John Fromm, who said, "Why are we taking those pelts to New York and having them made when I can do it up here at Hamburg?" And he did it, and he, unbeknownst to a lot of the Niemans and Fromms, and he made his coats up there. He self-taught himself, right? And he made those coats, and they started selling them direct up at Hamburg. And then after that, they also made the fur buyers come from New York to Hamburg to buy.
Do you know what years that was?
36 to about 1940.
The reason I ask is that originally there was the Frum Brothers Nieman Company, where the two families were together, and then there was a major problem. Let's just call it a problem. And then the company split into the Niemans. Now, Uncle Ed, on the Fox Farm Curve, as they call it, on 57, he married a Frum. And but he was part of the Nieman family. And yet he was part of the Frums too. And he and Doc Roberts that you mentioned earlier, Doc Roberts was a biochemistry, he had a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin, and he was a true expert in nutrition. And he and my uncle owned the Fromm Dog Food Company at the end anyway. Doc Roberts' son and I have done research together. We're still very good friends and so forth. But some of the family members didn't remain good friends in a series of business splits. And that's why I asked it, what year did that happen?
I don't remember, but also Henry Fromm, he sort of split off all by himself, if you remember. In fact, his ranch, when I used to go up there, I used to haul meat food up to him, and they weren't sure if his residence was in Michigan or Wisconsin.
So he paid taxes to neither. That's a good idea. No, I was kidding.
I don't know, he paid taxes, maybe to Alaska, I don't know.
Right. But it's the old story of a family that got together, they were doing super, and then money comes into play, and it causes all kinds of problems. And that's why I've chosen to remain at the university and be poor.
Howard?
There was an article in the National Geographic
Right, it's a good
in
article.
1948, March of 1948. It's entitled "The Romance of the Fur Industry," and it goes into how they made a coat, built a coat, and it's really complex. And they split fur and cut it all in little strips and sewed it all together to make, and it's very interesting. And there's Ronald Stevenson is mentioned in that article as being an aviator and a photographer, and there's an excellent picture in there of the Fromm brothers Nieman fur ranch, what's called the Maine, I guess. Is that where the golf course is now?
Yes.
There's an excellent picture, and it's amazing the size of that. And according to that article, Fromm brothers Nieman, between the Hamburg Ranch and this Thiensville Ranch, had 200,000 acres under fox. That's a lot of acreage. And they also attributed 40,000 pelts a year, mink pelts and fox pelts, to that farm. So that figure of 100,000 certainly would be very close when you consider all the Nieman farms put together with that Fromm brothers Nieman.
I just wanted to mention one thing. We're not talking about 20 horses a day out there at the Maine. We're talking about 100 horses a day were slaughtered. And sometimes more, depending on the time of the year. Sometimes as much as 120 horses a day.
It was a big, I
That
think
doesn't sound right.
most people don't realize how big an operation that it was. And, it was a real, I think in that article, maybe it was in the National Geographic, where it talked about, I think it was in 1947, where the fox industry brought in $1.3 million in pelt sales. Yes, sir.
The reason that they hauled all these foxes up north, really, is up there they had, I think at one time they had 3 ranges that were like 80 acres apiece, and they were in the woods. And they had people went through them and took all the stumps and snags and dead branches, and everything was cleaned out. And then they would release these foxes in there to run wild. And they would line the tubs of meat up, and the reason was so they wouldn't rub each other, they wouldn't have stain marks on them, on the pelts and everything. And of course the weather to let them really fur out before they were slaughtered. And then to catch them, they would divide the pen in half when they drive them through that, and then a quarter and an eighth, and down to where they could catch them out of these long pens.
On the DVD, you can actually see them doing this drive, and as they walked through one set of fences, the fence had been rolled up, and they dropped the fence and put some logs on it, and gradually it got smaller and smaller, like the pit and the pendulum, and then that's where the last part would be done.
Okay, yeah, Gary.
There's going to be an article about the Fromms in this next Sunday's Milwaukee Journal. So it won't be about here, but it'll be about Hamburg.
Okay, once again, thank you for attending, and let's thank our panelists for interesting presentation. And we'll take a little break, and we'll get Gordon's DVD set up. And in the meantime, if there's probably, hopefully, some more coffee and cookies there, and then let's share some things with the participants. Thank you much.